Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and today we're going to discuss the sad story of segregated America. And specifically, we're going to talk about the early civil rights movement, the people who first pushed back against Jim Crow. And along the way, we're going to meet Jim Crow himself, Sundown Town's strange fruit, the Great Migration, the Waco Horror, the Atlanta Compromise, and the ships of the Black Star Line. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head, so put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow, as we build an answer to that question on the lower left. Why did Martin Luther King Jr. succeed when others did not? What exactly was Jim Crow? What were the earlier strategies that fought it? Were King's tactics substantially different? How was the nation substantially different by, King's day? And was King really just the collective accumulation of the long decades of the civil rights struggle? Why did King change the country in a way that previous civil rights leaders did not? Now, a review. In the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the Supreme Court held that the principle of separate but equal was permissible under the Constitution. So, the Supreme Court decided that it would not enforce civil rights for African Americans. Racial segregation, the Supreme Court upheld, was completely constitutional. Now, following this, the South would continue to build a fully segregated society, a racially segregated America. They were going to build the Jim Crow South, and the people that did the building were called the Bourbon Democrats. So, who were the Bourbon Democrats? Those guys are some of the Bourbon Democrats. Now, the Bourbon Democrats, all caps, the Bourbon Democrats were largely the old Confederates left over from the Civil War. Now, basically, once African-American Republicans were suppressed, the Bourbon Democrats basically took over the southern states. By the 1880s, 10 of the 11 states of the old Confederacy were either governed by former Confederate generals or by former senior officials of the Confederate government. The Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, became the governor of Georgia. All right. Hence, you have this phrase in terms of the Civil War that the South lost the war, but they won the peace. Now, before we get into the society that these guys built, I do want to give you a little bit of a warning. We're getting into some really spicy history here and some really ugly history. And we're going to look at some stuff that's pretty ugly, but it actually happened. And it's important to acknowledge the ugliness of the past, especially of the Southern past, as we talk about the world they built, the world of Jim Crow. Okay, so what was Jim Crow? That is Jim Crow. Jim Crow was the term applied to this racist society that was built in the South. Now, Jim Crow itself was a racist caricature from the 19th century. It was where white actors would dress up in blackface and sort of pantomime these comedy shows for white audiences. And the Jim Crow character itself was, lazy, dressed in rags, interested only in dancing and eating and drinking. And the term Jim Crow eventually became a pejorative insult to be leveled against African Americans throughout the 19th century. So when the Bourbon Democrats start passing these laws to limit the civil rights of African Americans, these laws collectively become known as Jim Crow laws, and the society and the land they create become known as, the Jim Crow South. So what were these Jim Crow laws? All right, here's exactly the world that the Bourbon Democrats built. The Jim Crow laws were a series of laws that divided Southern society into two sections, one white and one black, with the African Americans placed decidedly in a position of marked inferiority. Now, on its most superficial level, the Jim Crow laws created two of everything: two waiting rooms, two sections of a bus, two sections of a train, two sections of a restaurant, two school systems, two sets of hotels, two medical systems. You weren't allowed to move donated blood from white people into black people or black people into white people. It's absolutely crazy. Two different sets of sports. You had, baseball teams for the whites. You had baseball teams for the blacks. There were even 2 sets of different graveyards. Even in death, Southerners were not allowed, to racially integrate. And the most infamous and the most visible aspects of Jim Crow were drinking fountains. You would have, and this is what you see right up above me, you have a drinking fountain for the whites and drinking fountain for the coloreds. And you can quite clearly see which fountain is the nicer. And again, but look, that's just one pipe connecting the two. It's the same water, okay? So always, when you had 2 of everything, the lesser quality facilities were always marked for colored use, all right? This was the Jim Crow South. And it also included these things known as sundown towns. Now, what is a sundown town? I have to try to explain what a sundown town is. Sundown towns were small communities that were made ethnically uniform specifically for white people, all right? That African Americans were not allowed to own property inside these towns. And they were called sundown towns because while African Americans could visit the town and they could work in the town, they weren't allowed to stay there after dark. Hence you have that sign right there, whites only within city limits after dark. So you had to be gone by sundown, hence the term sundown town. You see the sign, and these sundown towns weren't limited to the South. That sign right up above me, that's from a Detroit suburb. Anyway, so you have these little ethnically pure towns scattered all over the South. And it's always quite interesting to sort of, you can go on websites and you can look up like which towns were sundown towns. And it's quite surprising like how many of them there were, where simply African Americans were not allowed to stay there after dark. They certainly weren't allowed to have property. And even to this day, you can visit these old sundown towns, and it's very ethnically uniform, even to this day. So we're going to look at a series of pictures at this world that was built, the Jim Crow South. And again, note how racially segregated it is. Here we have a city bus. The front section was for whites, the back section was for blacks, and there was sort of a middle section where the overflow would go. But again, the inferior qualities, the inferior aspect is always given to the African Americans. Hence, in this middle section, if a white person wanted a black person's seat, the African American person had to stand up and leave. All right? This gets important later on when we get to Rosa Parks. And again, 2 of everything. 2 sets of laundromats, 2 sets of theaters, different bathrooms. And please note, you've got the ladies' room, the men's room, and then you have the colored room. They don't even get gender separated bathrooms. This was the Jim Crow South. And I do want to point out that like actual businesses, the people who ran movie theaters and the people who ran laundromats and the people who ran trains actually hated this because it meant that everything was twice as expensive. They had to build 2 of everything. If you're a businessman and you want to build like a movie theater, you can't just build a movie theater and sell tickets. You've got to build a movie theater. You've got to have a white section. You've got to have a black section. You've got to have a white box office. You've got to have a black box office. You have got a white set of bathrooms, a black set of bathrooms, and then double janitors to clean both of them. So businesses themselves actually really hated having anything to do with the Jim Crow South. And it's one of the reasons that the South became so poor in the 20th century. But it wasn't just that there were 2 of everything, with the inferior version of everything being given over to African Americans. It was even worse than that. This was often accompanied by dozens of petty slights and insults. All African Americans were expected to say, step off the sidewalk to make way for whites. Blacks were always referred to by their first name, but were expected to use the last name of the whites. Basically, they were treated like children. Every black man, regardless of how old or dignified, was always referred to as boy. All right? African Americans were expected to be deferential and always respectful of whites, regardless of their own social rank or age. So you'd have these prosperous black farmers. They're doing quite well. They've got quite a bit of money. They're dressing very well, but they are still treated as the social inferior of the poorest, most ignorant white in the South. This is the ugliness of the Jim Crow system. But it was even worse than that. It was more than just that. Jim Crow wasn't just built out of sheer total racial hatred. It was built for economic reasons. Jim Crow intended to keep Black Americans poor, uneducated, and subservient to the rich whites of the South. After all, the South still depended on the labor of African American sharecroppers. I mean, you look at those cotton pickers on the upper left. I mean, it looks like it should be a scene from like 1850. No, that photograph was taken in like 1910. I mean, it shows you just like how little had changed by the time you get to the early 20th century. Jim Crow was used to keep African Americans trapped inside of a system that used their labor, yet denied them the fruits of their labor. And specifically, they wanted to keep African Americans uneducated. I mean, look at that picture right up above me. That's a black school around 1900. And they wanted to do this for a reason. A lot of these black farmers were sharecroppers. And at the end of a harvest, there's a lot of math involved. And almost universally, the white landowners would cheat them out of their earnings, would cheat them at the end of every harvest. And you know, there's a lot of math involved. So you wanted to keep your workers uneducated. And the entire system was wrapped up and bound with violence. Violence, both official violence and unofficial violence, supported the entirety of this ugly system. Now, official violence would be the unfair and unequal treatment by police. Like, they had these racist laws like vagrancy laws, where people could be arrested for not working, even on a Saturday. But somehow, the police would always arrest the African Americans and they'd leave the poor whites alone. And again, this was accompanied by unofficial violence, which would be people being beaten by lynch mobs, being murdered by lynch mobs. My God. All right. And often these murders would never be investigated by police. And it wasn't just that, even if the violence isn't there, even if the violence isn't in your face every day, the threat of the violence is. And it was often the threat of a violence that was enough. And even if the violence wasn't here, like in the room, it was just outside the door. And this triggered one of the greatest, most haunting songs in American history, Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. Everybody knew about the violence. Everybody knew somebody who got murdered. Everybody knew somebody who got lynched. You could hear them torturing people in the woods. All right? And this is what inspired, you know, this absolutely hauntingly beautiful song that Billie Holiday sings. And if you've never heard Strange Fruit, you really should. Strange Fruit it's about the violence of the system and what the violence of the system did to people, even the threat and the presence of violence. I mean, it was terrible. Now, this is depressing. Anyway, there were several reactions to this. The African Americans did not take this sitting down. And there were several different responses to this ugly Jim Crow world that was constructed. And all of these responses were all morally laden as the African Americans confronted the ugliness and the evil of the system. And ultimately, the question is this: do you stay in the South and fight the injustice of the system? Do you fight for your civil rights, which are supposedly guaranteed by the Constitution, even though that violence is there? It's right outside the door. Or do you say, you know, to hell with this. I'm leaving. I don't need to be here. I can pack everything onto a train and I can be gone tomorrow. And one of the great civil rights leaders of this early period, that's what he did. You know, the first black governor of the United States, the former governor of Louisiana, PBS Pinchback, Civil War veteran, lawyer, a man of wealth, power, and distinction, lived in New Orleans. But he had his life threatened so often and so credibly that by the time you get to 1892, Pinchback is done. All right. He's not going to take it anymore. He can't fight this system. He had a wife, he had 4 kids. He wasn't going to risk them. He packed up everything he had and he moved north. And he eventually settled in New York and then I think Washington, D.C. Was he wrong to do this? He was a leader of the African American. He was a leader among African Americans. Was he wrong to just leave? Because that's what he did. And a lot of people followed him. This is the Great Migration, where it's the largest internal population movement in American history. And 6.5 million people made the same decision that PBS Pinchback did. There they are, loading all of your belongings in a car and wishing the South goodbye. The Great Migration, and it's documented in this brilliant history by Isabel Wilkerson that you can see up there on the left. This is a fantastic book. And the Great Migration itself was the largest internal population movement in American history. Some 6.5 million African Americans fled the Jim Crow South for cities in the North or the West. They left rural Mississippi to go to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. They left, the terror of rural Georgia for New York, Boston, Philadelphia. From Louisiana and Texas, they headed west to Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco. This permanently divided African Americans in the United States into 2 sections. You have northern blacks who generally live inside these large cities in these ethnic enclaves. And then you have the southern blacks generally who stayed, who lived in the countryside and in these small towns. And this kind of division continues to this very day. And for the people who did head north on the Great Migration, now, life wasn't perfect in these big cities, in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or Detroit. In fact, one migrant, a doctor from Louisiana, and this is in Isabel Wilkerson's book, he leaves the violence of rural Louisiana, drives to Los Angeles to try and set himself up as a surgeon. The guy's a doctor, all right? And he describes that, I left the land of Jim Crow to land in the city of James Crow. Because the segregation was still there, but it was just different. Now, Black Americans in these cities found themselves basically confined to these very distinct ethnic ghettos. But at least, once they were in these enclaves, they were mostly left alone. I mean, you weren't being hunted by the Klan. And inside these enclaves, African Americans were allowed to build their own society, their own police force, their own restaurants, their own hotels. They pursued their own middle-class lifestyle. And there's a bit of rare archival footage right there of what, Harlem looked like back in the day. And they did maintain family ties with their Southern cousins. So, this division among African Americans wasn't absolute. And sometimes really amazing things happened in these ethnic enclaves, including the largest and most famous one, which was Harlem in New York City. And inside Harlem, there is this sort of genesis of music and art and poetry and literature. And it becomes known as the Harlem Renaissance, this explosion of jazz and the blues and dance and the Cotton Club and Langston Hughes and incredible art. All of this is kind of generated as African Americans are finally allowed to build their own society inside their own communities, even though it was in this big ethnically segregated city of New York. And in fact, it is in the Harlem Renaissance that Billie Holiday emerges as one of the greatest singers in American history. And there she is, singing in a smoky Harlem nightclub. And Harlem got so incredible and so popular, and the art and the music that was being produced there was so awesome. It became one of the great artistic centers, of New York. It was just absolutely incredible. But let's go back to our decision. What is the moral thing to do? What should you do? Okay, imagine you are, an African-American dude. It is 1910. It is 1920. You are in the South. Things are bad. All right. What do? Do you stay and fight for your civil rights and risk everything, because the violence is there? Or do you just leave? And that's what these guys did. These packed everything in a train, packed everything in a car, and they're gone. All right? Is it more moral to stay and fight, even though that can cost you everything, including your life? Or do you pack it all in and leave? What would you have done? I mean, think about this for a second. What would you have done? Because, there are people who stayed, and these people stayed. And life was possible inside the Jim Crow South. And for African Americans, it just meant you had to accept an existence as a hated and exploited minority. And your existence would be bounded by very harsh and sharp boundaries. But you had a community inside those boundaries. And at the heart of the community was the African American church. And at the center of that church was the local pastor, the local reverend, who became not just a religious leader, but a social leader, and in many ways, a political leader as well. And if there were problems inside the Black community, you would go to the reverend, you'd go to the pastor, you'd go to the church to resolve them, because you certainly weren't going to go to the white sheriff, because you weren't getting anything from him. And for a small number of African Americans in the South, they even became quite prosperous. Doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. This happened in the Jim Crow South. There we've got somebody in a Victorian riding dress, an African-American debutante ball. There we have the faculty from the Tuskegee Institute, which we'll talk about in just a tick. These are professors, mathematicians, scientists, surgeons, businessmen. For a tiny fraction of African Americans, prosperity was possible, but it meant accepting your place in this unequal and unfair society. It meant understanding there were certain dangers to this world that you had to take into consideration. For instance, green books. If you've never heard of a green book, I've got a very sad story to tell you. That African Americans began to publish these books out of Chicago called the Negro Motorist Green Book. And this is the horrible thing about green books. Green books were for African Americans driving from one part of the South to another part of the South. And basically a green book would tell you how dangerous the place you were driving through was, where the sundown towns were, where hotels were that would rent to Black people, where you could buy gas, where the good restaurants were, where the racists were, where the racists weren't, where were the people who would give you a fair deal, where were the people that would rip you off. That such a book was even necessary and that such a book was even popular speaks to the cruelty and the exploitation of the system. The Jim Crow South, please put this in your notes, was bad, all right? And some people decided to leave. Other people decided to stay and fight. And one of the people who did stay was that woman right there. And her name was Ida B. Wells, 1863 to 1931. Now, Ida Wells was born in Mississippi, where she earned a college education there at one of these historically Black colleges. And she became a reporter writing for Black newspapers in and around Memphis, Tennessee. And in particular, one of the things that Ida Wells did is she began to document how the entire Jim Crow system was, in fact, predicated on violence or the threat of violence. She attacked this Southern idea that somehow Jim Crow segregation was voluntary and that it was beneficial and that it was, like the Supreme Court said, separate but equal. It was separate, but it was decidedly unequal, and violence supported the system. And she documented how much violence supported the system. After all, if the system is supposed to be equal, then why is there so much violence attached to it? And it's violence directed at a specific minority, at African Americans. Now, in Ida Wells's two books, Southern Horrors, 1892, and The Red Record of 1895, she carefully and precisely documented the level of violence directed against African Americans. She showed how these thousands of murders, and there were thousands, had very little to do with sexual violence. That's the excuse that Southerners gave. Oh, he raped this woman, so we had to murder him and set him on fire. She says, no. This is about economics. It's not about sexual violence. She's pointing out how exploitative the system actually is. Southern whites lynched blacks who competed with them economically, and they punished others in order to keep them in their place as second-class citizens. Spurred on by Ida Wells' research, like Northern Republicans finally began to protect their old African-American allies in the South. Senator Leonidas Dyer, there he is right there, actually wrote the Dyer Anti-Lynching Law of 1918. And the Dyer Anti-Lynching Law sought to make racial lynching a federal crime, enforceable by federal police and subject to federal courts. Because you'd have these people who would get killed in the South, they would catch the murderer, and then an all-white jury would let them go. Southern Democrats killed the bill, and Leonidas Dyer sent it up again, and they would be killed again. And Dyer submitted it year after year after year, even though it cost him support among his fellow Republicans who had long since given up on the South. Leonidas Dyer was like, look, I don't care if this gets shot down every year. It is a moral imperative to fight this wicked Jim Crow system. And Dyer worked with Ida Wells to attempt to impose some kind of federal justice on the Jim Crow South. And eventually Ida Wells is herself forced out of the South. She's driven out of Tennessee. And I want you to wrap your brain around this logic here. Ida Wells documents how violence supports the Jim Crow system. This angers Southern whites. So the Southern whites, because she's accusing them of violence, in order to prove her wrong, threaten her life, smash into the newspaper she works for, and wrecks the place and threatens to kill her. All right. Ida Wells is basically driven from Tennessee in 1891, and she eventually is forced north along the Great Migration. She eventually ends up in Chicago. In fact, if you go to Chicago today, there's this big mural to Ida B. Wells. She wasn't really given any choice, should you stay or should you go? She stayed, she tried to fight, and her life was threatened, and she had to leave. Particularly fearless is that guy right there. I mean, this guy is fearless. And his name is Harry Moore, 1905 to 1951. Now, Harry Moore was the NAACP field representative in Florida, and Harry Moore was fearless. I mean, this guy's an American hero. Harry Moore crisscrossed Florida registering blacks to vote, something you were not supposed to do. In fact, at one point in time, he personally registered like 31% of all African Americans in Florida. He got them to vote. He investigated lynchings. He defended people who had been innocently accused. And actually, the NAACP told him to actually stop doing this because, as we'll discuss in a bit, this was not the NAACP's approach to fighting segregation. But Harry Moore was able to show again and again and again how violent the system was. And he attempted to fight against the violence. And he got sort of wrapped up in this one case where these two black men were accused of raping this woman. They were basically arrested. Then they were convicted. But Harry Moore was able to show that no actual evidence had ever been presented at their trial, and that the men were probably innocent, and he got a federal judge to overturn their conviction. Hence, the two men deserved retrial. And then the two men, while being transferred from one jail to another, were mysteriously shot while trying to escape. And Harry Moore was able to show that, in fact, what had happened is they'd taken these two men out of jail, put them in the back of a police car, and while they were driving down a state highway, the local sheriff basically just pulled to the side of the road and murdered both men in the back of the squad car. That these two men had been murdered by the local sheriff, and he was able to force local courts to start bringing up murder charges against this local sheriff. And Harry Moore, absolutely fearless, and that's why they killed him. Harry Moore was murdered on Christmas, 1951, and he was murdered by somebody who knew the layout of his house, because they went underneath his house and stacked dynamite underneath where his bed was, and it exploded in 1951, killing both Harry Moore and later his wife died in a hospital. I mean, Jim Crow played for keeps. Right? When Ida B. Wells fled Memphis, she didn't flee just because she got the vapors. All right? She was in fear of her life. So here is this kind of moral dilemma. It is 1910, it's 1920, it's 1930. What do? Do you stay and fight this exploitative, hateful system? Or do you leave? You can go Harlem. You can go listen to Billie Holiday sing. You don't need to be here. And throughout the early 20th century, it got worse, all right? It gets steadily worse throughout this period until you have the sort of nadir of race relations in the 1920s. I mean, here's the Klan in 1920. The Klan is actually revived in the 1920s, and it goes public. I mean, note these Klansmen, they're not wearing masks. They want people to see their faces. And in fact, the Klan itself peaks in the year 1924 with 3 million registered Klansmen nationwide. It's incredible. And then Jim Crow began to actually spread to parts of the nation that had never been parts of the old Confederacy. It began to spread to Oklahoma, to Missouri, to West Virginia, to Delaware. Parts of Jim Crow began to spread to Kansas, New Mexico, Arizona. Jim Crow is spreading across the entire nation. And there you would find these incredible situations where African Americans who had gone on the Great Migration to escape from Jim Crow found that Jim Crow was following them. All right. And this kind of culminates in one of these really horrible events, something called the Tulsa Massacre. Because what happened is that in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you had all these African Americans who had fled the Deep South, going on the Great Migration, and they had settled in Tulsa. And they had built a very prosperous local community. It was so prosperous, it was actually called, Black Wall Street. But then, year after year, this Jim Crow law gets passed. That Jim Crow law gets passed. Another Jim Crow law gets passed. Oh, there we've got colored and white water fountains springing up all over town. And the African Americans of Tulsa weren't going to have it. They started fighting back. And then it came to another story of Jim Crow, an innocent black man accused of some trumped up crime and thrown in the local clink, and a white lynch mob come to kill him. And in Tulsa, they weren't going to take it. The African Americans of Tulsa, basically reached in their closets, took out their guns, and attempted to free this man from jail. And the result was a massive running gun battle throughout Tulsa, Oklahoma. Lasted like 2 or 3 days. And it ended with these white mobs storming in and burning out Black Wall Street. This is the Tulsa Massacre, the worst act of racial violence in American history. The lynch mob even got like local airplanes to drop dynamite. They bombed the black section of Tulsa. Tulsa was bad. It was this anti-black riot, 1921, destroyed the black section of Tulsa, killed over 100 people over 2 days, and it burned most of Tulsa to the ground. And there you can see a photograph from the burning sections of Tulsa. And again, the Southerners were proud of this. Look at what somebody wrote on that photograph. Running the Negro out of Tulsa, June 1921. They spelled running wrong. There's your literacy test. Faced with the violence and the cruelty of the Jim Crow South, African Americans did fight back against this system. And basically there were 4 ways of fighting back against this system, 4 basic approaches to combating Jim Crow. And we're going to deal with each of these very, very quickly. They were basically the approach developed by the NAACP, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and lastly, Marcus Garvey. And we're going to start with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, it was actually founded in 1909 as a response to the construction of Jim Crow. Now, the NAACP was, from the beginning, a multiracial organization, and its guiding leader between 1929 and 1955 is that guy on the lower left, and his name is Walter White. And Walter White developed a very particular and specific strategy to defeating Jim Crow. The NAACP, under Walter White, eschewed social activism, and it settled on a narrow, legalistic strategy. They decided they were going to sue Jim Crow to death. They reasoned that the various Jim Crow laws were blatant violations of the Reconstruction Amendments of the 14th and the 15th Amendment, and they are kind of right. So what the NAACP argued is, look, we don't need to do a lot of social activism. What we need to do is take them to court again and again and again and again. We're going to argue and litigate and re-argue, argue again, and re-litigate cases in front of judges. And to do so, to pursue this very narrow legalistic strategy, they hired some of the best lawyers in the country and even trained up some of their own lawyers. And some of these lawyers included one of the greatest legal minds of the 20th century, Thurgood Marshall. Now, Marshall had read the Constitution. Thurgood Marshall knew the law. And Thurgood Marshall said, this is a winning strategy, but it is a very slow strategy. And it is a strategy that is going to take decades. And one of the real ironies of Thurgood Marshall is, where did Thurgood Marshall study law? Howard University. So follow the train of events. The federal government reneges on its promises to African Americans. An outraged General Howard builds Howard University. Howard University builds a law school. The law school trains up Thurgood Marshall, and Thurgood Marshall sues the federal government to fulfill its promises that it made at the end of the Civil War. So it's a very long circle. It took almost 70 years. But others criticized the NAACP's approach. They said, look, this legalistic strategy is too slow. It's too fussy, and it relies on something we can't trust, which is the courts actually enforcing their own laws. And one of the critics of the NAACP was Harry Moore, that guy over there. And Harry Moore's like, no, we've got to get out there. We've got to register people to vote. We've got to save people from being murdered by lynch mobs. We've got to save people from being murdered by police. And Walter White is like, look, Harry, yeah, that's all good. And I'm not disagreeing with you. But if you do that, it's going to get you killed. And it did. It did. All right. Now we're going to move on to W.E.B. Du Bois. It's French, but he wanted it pronounced Du Bois because he said he wanted it pronounced in an American way. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963. Now, Du Bois was a Northerner, and this is important. He's from the North. He's educated at Harvard University. He doesn't grow up wealthy, but he grows up in a fairly affluent household. Now, Du Bois had helped found the NAACP, yet Du Bois found himself really dissatisfied with the slow legal strategy they employed. Du Bois wanted a more Harry Moore approach, a strong activist approach, a strategy aimed at exposing the violence of Jim Crow. He urged activists to begin a campaign of civil disobedience, voter registration, and public awareness of the deep, deep corruption of the South. W.E.B. Du Bois wanted full civil rights, and he wanted them now. And he writes about this over and over and over in his many, many books. Du Bois was ultimately an academic. He was a university professor. He was a social scientist who focused on the economic reasons behind the disenfranchisement of Black Americans, pointing out the economic and sociological reasons behind Jim Crow. He points out the system is designed to economically exploit African Americans. And again and again and again, Du Bois challenged the supposed racial inferiority of African Americans, often by engaging in these public debates with racists and Klansmen and making fools of them, as they just could not match the intellect of W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, Dr. Du Bois was like incredibly intelligent. And famously, he wrote a book about what slavery and the Jim Crow mentality had actually done to the psychology and psyche of African Americans. That's probably his most famous book there on the upper left, The Souls of Black Folk, published 1903. Now, Du Bois founded a magazine called The Crisis, and The Crisis is the official magazine of the NAACP. But they kind of turned it over to him, all right? The NAACP is like, okay, we're just going to sue, and we're going to get a bunch of lawyers, and we're going to go to court. They sort of let Du Bois have The Crisis. Now, Du Bois used The Crisis to push his own activist ideas, often to the consternation of the more conservative NAACP. He used The Crisis as his own platform to expose the violence of the South, often continuing many of the works of Ida Wells. He began to publish statistics detailing the scale of racial violence. Du Bois began to, this is incredible, publish photographs of murdered Black men, photographs that were intended to shock the reader. And in fact, he publicized the murder of a 17-year-old boy in Waco, Texas, in 1916. And this kid was named Jesse Washington. All right, here's the very sad case of the Waco Horror. This is what happens with Jesse Washington. Jesse Washington was 17 years old. He was in Waco, Texas, and he was basically, okay, he was retarded, all right? Jesse Washington was this retarded black boy, and he worked as a farmhand for this local white couple who basically gave him a job because they felt sorry for him. So he does basically odd jobs around their farm. And then one day, the white woman of that farm was found beaten to death on her own doorstep. And the police were like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. Who was the last person here? Oh, it was Jesse. So they went and got Jesse, who's basically just sitting on his porch, all right? He actually has a bad nosebleed. And they arrest him, and they basically beat a confession out of him. And Jesse Washington is forced to confess to the murder of his employer. But like none of it passes the smell test. I mean, the Jesse Washington case is all extremely weird. All right. I mean, he has no reason to murder her. She employed him. They were on good terms. He seemed quite shocked when they told him she had died. And think about it. Even if you're retarded, you murder a white woman in Waco, Texas in 1916. Holy cow, you better be halfway to the Mexican border by sundown. And Jesse Washington was found guilty of murdering this woman. And a crowd of 10,000 people surged into the courtroom and dragged him out to the town square in Waco, Texas. And they tortured him for 2 hours before killing him. And W.B. Du Bois sneaked secret reporters into Waco, and he got like photographs of the event, and he got firsthand accounts of the murder of Jesse Washington, and he published them because W.B. Du Bois realized that photographs can do what like basic numbers don't. And I'm going to show you one of the photographs he published. It's pretty bad. All right. But that's what they did to Jesse Washington. They basically murder him, and 10,000 people watch Jesse Washington get murdered in Waco, Texas. And no one was arrested for it. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois himself had this really prickly, demanding personality. Du Bois did not work well with others. He found the slow legal strategy of the NAACP to be infuriating, especially when faced with things like the murder of Jesse Washington. And Du Bois became more and more political over time. He embraced socialism. He even started flirting with communism a little bit. He resigns from the NAACP in 1934 because he's like, look, you can't sue evil to death. And the NAACP was like, yeah, but I think we can sue evil to death. But W.B. Du Bois' greatest rival was not with the NAACP. Du Bois' polar opposite and intellectual equal was a guy named Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington, 1856 to 1950, he wasn't born in the North. He wasn't born to an affluent family. Booker T. Washington was born a slave in the South. Washington taught himself to read. He worked in factories, he worked on cotton fields, he worked in mines to pay for his own education. He's almost entirely self-educated. And Washington intentionally allied himself with powerful white patrons and used their money to basically build this school in Alabama, a school for teachers that he called the Tuskegee Institute, that later will become Tuskegee University. Now, Booker T. Washington held a very different approach from W.E.B. Du Bois, and it was a very pragmatic approach. Washington says, look, the system is ugly, the system is brutal, but we have to work within this system. Washington argued that Jim Crow could not be beaten, not within his lifetime. Thus, he pursued, and this is very controversial, a strategy of accommodation. American blacks, Washington argued, should focus on improving their own position, not fighting for civil rights. And they should do this primarily through education. And, oh, look, there's an American history class at the Tuskegee Institute. Oh, look, there's Washington. Anyway, Washington argued that self-improvement was the way to achieve civil rights. African Americans should build economic power first and then work towards political power. Now, this has been termed the Atlanta Compromise, the idea that American blacks would not challenge Jim Crow directly, and they would not challenge it in return for being largely left alone and being educated. Now, the type of energetic activism which was proposed by W.B. Du Bois, Washington thought, he said, that's just going to get people killed. All right. Things aren't going to change for now. We've got to sort of do the best we can within this harsh and unjust system. You know, like, and this is an open debate. Like, was Washington wrong to argue this? W.E.B. Du Bois certainly thought so. Du Bois countered this. He said he called Washington a lapdog of white racism in the South. And that was one of the more polite terms that was leveled at Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington writes this book, Up From Slavery, and he's most closely associated with the Tuskegee Institute, which is today the Tuskegee University. And in fact, Booker T. Washington is president of the university between 1881 and 1915. Booker T. Washington had powerful friends, like really powerful friends, like as powerful as they get. Booker T. Washington knew the president. Booker T. Washington knew Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington several times to dinner at the White House. And Theodore Roosevelt visited the Tuskegee Institute several times to speak with students, to teach classes in American history, and to give a speech to the students there. So, I mean, Booker T. Washington had powerful friends. He got them to donate money, and he used that money to teach black teachers. And the early days of the civil rights struggle is generally portrayed as a debate between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And certainly the two men didn't exactly like one another, even though they did write a book together at one point in time. They were very cool towards one another. Booker T. Washington was very polite and icy towards Du Bois, and Du Bois wrote nasty, spiteful things about Booker T. Washington. But to be honest, Du Bois wrote nasty, spiteful things about everybody. He was a very thin-skinned guy. But were they really opponents? I mean, they certainly had no great love of each other. But I think that while they disagreed on tactics, they disagreed on how to fight Jim Crow. They didn't disagree that Jim Crow needed to be fought. And to some extent, each man, was the whetstone to the edge of the other. Both men made each other's intellectual edge even sharper. And I think there was a mutual respect between the two men, even though they didn't like one another and fundamentally disagreed. Anyway, now we're going to move on to our fourth approach on how to fight Jim Crow, or how to just escape from Jim Crow. And this is the most radical of all of these early civil rights leaders. And this guy, there he is right there, Marcus Garvey, 1887 to 1940. Marcus Garvey was actually born in Jamaica, but he emigrated to the United States. And Garvey argued, he said, this is what Garvey argues. Look, the United States is simply too racist to ever accommodate African Americans at all. Marcus Garvey starts this newspaper called Negro World. And in his newspaper, Garvey argued that America would never accept black Americans as equals. The only thing that African Americans could do, Garvey argued, was leave. We simply need to leave. Garvey argued that African Americans should emigrate to Africa and establish a new country in that continent. He supported the idea of complete separation. And in 1919, he established a shipping company to just do that. He called it the Black Star Line. And he began asking for donations. He began asking people to buy shares in the Black Star Line. And then Garvey did probably his most controversial thing. He began accepting money from white racists. He began accepting money from the Ku Klux Klan. All right. Indeed, these super white racists wanted African Americans to leave the country. And because of this, because Garvey is associating with these really hardcore Jim Crow guys, The NAACP and the rest of the civil rights movement want nothing to do with Marcus Garvey. They wanted nothing to do with it. All right, as he's sort of buying ships and building the Black Star Line. But also Marcus Garvey began like wearing military uniforms and declaring himself to be the president of Africa. So there is that. Now, the Black Star Line rapidly ran into financial difficulties. A lot of money went missing. And Garvey would be actually fighting corruption charges for the rest of his life. Calvin Coolidge has to pardon him at one point in time. And I mean, on one hand, it's kind of, on one hand, you kind of want to mock Marcus Garvey. He calls himself the president of Africa. He's kind of a large fellow. He dresses like that. But you really shouldn't. That gives Garvey short shrift. Marcus Garvey is a very important figure. Marcus Garvey is on the edge of what will eventually be known as Black militantism, Black nationalism. Garvey argued that African Americans possess a unique place in the world, and their unique history makes them special. This unique identity should be cultivated apart from any other American identity. And if you think about this minority that has been hated and despised for decades on decades, and suddenly this guy appears that goes, no, you're special. All of these things are happening to you to make you the most unique people with a destiny that has yet to be fulfilled. That is a powerful idea, powerful idea. And this idea will eventually lead to the Black Power movements of the 1960s and 1970s. And to the idea that African Americans deserve their own nation, or at the very least, deserve their own state. And you can draw a direct line between Marcus Garvey and a fellow we'll meet in a little bit called Malcolm X. So here are the four basic approaches to fighting the Jim Crow South. The NAACP wants litigation, slow and steady. We can win it in the courts. W.E.B. Du Bois wants social activism, even if it's incredibly dangerous. Number 3, Booker T. Washington wants accommodation. We can't fix the society the way it is, so we just need to improve our place within that society. Or Marcus Garvey, we just need to get out, not just to Detroit or Los Angeles or Chicago or Harlem. We need to leave America entirely. And we're going to see how these strategies play out in the next section. And I will see you there.